I'm thrilled to have a great panel here today. In the middle here we have Christine Lee. She's the Vice President of Business Development for Immersv. And right here is Leslie Pirritano. She's the Global Account Manager for AMD. And on the far end is Robert Nashak.
Nashak.
Right, COO of Survios. So it's a great group. We have lots of different perspectives, and of course, again, the panel is strategies of, for publishing and marketing VR games. So the first question is, how do we, we've had a bit of a slow start with VR in terms of the hardware. When a publisher or developer, they're marketing their game, there's also this issue of having to educate the consumer as well. Do you guys have any thoughts on, what can we maybe do, like what can a developer do, what can a publisher do, what can we do from a hardware perspective to maybe educate consumers a little better on sort of, what VR is and what makes it unique?
So, I mean, of course, the people have to experience VR, right? I mean, that's our challenge is you have to get it in people's hands. You have to get the headsets on their heads so that they can play and see, et cetera. So, one of the things, some of the things we're doing are, being present at events. Everything from, supporting PCs and headsets at something like PAX or E3 to smaller events that might be, evening gatherings of people, within and without the industry, that kind of thing. So, working with retailers and their demos and just anything that helps get it in people's hands. And I think one of the things we need to do beyond that is kind of get creative on how we do that even more, because that's what buys people into VR is when they actually have the headset on and can't believe what they're seeing any longer.
I agree with all that. Can everyone hear me? First of all, thank you. This is the first time I've been the token male on a panel, and I'm thrilled. good work.
Yay!
So if you're interested in this topic, BBC came out with a study last year, and they said the challenge with marketing for VR is that people tend to market their content first and foremost and take for granted that people even know what VR is, and they don't. So you really have to market VR on top of the content you're providing in VR to make it work, and that's challenging. There's some, mixed realities. One good thing where you can show people moving and playing your game while being in the game. There's all sorts of tricks like that, but there's a fundamental challenge, like you were saying, that conversion only happens if people get to try VR for the first time. One thing we experienced was, our first game was Raw Data, which was a hit out of the box. It was the first game to make $1 million in its first month. We ported it over to PlayStation, and what was fascinating about that experience was we assumed that everyone knew about Raw Data, but the PlayStation user knows about PlayStation VR, might not even have heard of the Vive. So you've got different audiences, and depending on the platform, and you just got to be sensitive to that.
Yeah, and just to address the question from a different angle, because I think the question has two parts. It's how do you get to the consumer, and then the question is, as a developer, how do I get to the consumers that are already interested? So I'll kind of address that second part. I think there's kind of three main ways to break that down in terms of how are you discoverable as a developer. And I think the first, and you kind of mentioned this already, is working with the platforms. So working with Oculus, working with HTC, making sure that you're in early, getting feedback early before you actually launch. So that way, ideally, you'll be featured, you'll be preloaded. That's definitely a good way to be discoverable from the start. A second thing would be actually partnering with the distribution channels that are already out there. So there's a lot of great content platforms like Jaunt or Little Star, where if you are not necessarily doing a game, but you're doing a 2-minute 360 video or something where you want to get that content out, then you could work with the platforms to distribute that without having to do that on your own. And of course, the third way is buying it, right? So going out, doing PR, doing paid marketing. But there's ways to get that content out to users that would already be interested.
Just to drive that point home, on the launch day of Raw Data on Steam, we had tens of millions of impressions overall throughout all the media we were doing. 3/4 of them came from the feature spot on Steam. So featuring is everything, just like it is in the phone, mobile phone space, mobile game space, and that's all about relationship building. It really is.
That's interesting.
And good content.
Yeah.
And good content. I love that.
Good content.
Yeah, you need both.
And so, Leslie, from an AMD perspective, you know, in terms of partnering, you know, what does a developer kind of have to sort of have if they want to try and develop, say, with like work with AMD and get a partnership?
You know, okay. So I didn't expect that question.
I'm sorry.
So in terms of working with AMD, I mean, there's a variety of levels of partnerships, and you know, it can be anything from marketing to technical. So it kind of depends on you know, where you want to be, right? So you know, there are instances if you're working in APIs that are you know, take advantage of our graphics processors or our CPUs, then you can get some technical cooperation going between engineers and developers themselves. There's also kind of marketing levels of relationships, whether it be us showing at events or promoting socially, you know, things like that. I think for VR, of course, the best opportunity is showing at events. And probably something, I don't know how many people think of this or don't think of this, but what I see when we go out and try and show demos is that working the timing and the time, like getting people to get a headset on and to be able to have an experience, but with enough time that then it can go on to the next person and they can have an experience, right? And so, you know, 15 minutes kind of gets too long and the lines get too long and all of that. So I think that's a problem that I'd like to put out for developers to think of is you know, is it, you know, is the solution to do some videos where they can just kind of sit around and see the environment and some of the action so that it's more like a 360 video in the environment? Is it a, you know, 60 seconds in this is what you do with the controllers and then do it for 4 minutes, but something timed and something that keeps lines moving
fast.
in terms of demos.
Point.
So.
Yeah.
Just to answer the question about partnerships with the goal of marketing, I think there's a lot of really interesting things that are happening in VR right now. There's, especially as an indie game dev or as an indie developer, to get your content out there it is hard. I think somebody who we've worked with in the past that I admire a lot is a company called Sliver TV. It's an esports 360 VR platform, and they did a partnership with Rico Theta where they actually incorporated that into their virtual currency, and they're able to drive kind of cross-promote and get more users to Sliver and get more actual purchases of the Rico Theta 360. So I think that kind of partnership is really smart in that it's content and hardware really pushing the same story and being successful with that. So there's a lot of interesting stories like that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Greg Suarez is here, and we work together. He's amazing, by the way. And we worked together at Glue Mobile back before it was even called Glue Mobile. And back then, it was all about relationship building. You know, Greg was golfing with Verizon every morning, practically, kind of thing. And oftentimes, we had to, you know, they wanted us to show off their hardware, right? And that's totally what's happening in the VR space, as you'd expect. And we have great partnerships with AMD and with Intel. And what does that get us? Our second game is called Sprint Vector. Everyone said you couldn't go fast in VR. Sprint Vector solves that with a technology we call fluid locomotion. We talked to AMD early on about that, and they got excited by it. And one thing that came of it, our CEO spoke at a keynote that AMD hosted at GEC. One thing you got to keep in mind, as all of us are struggling in the retail consumer space to make money off of our content in VR because the install base is not great, these deals can often come with money, and it's a great way to drive revenues early on as everyone's waiting for VR to become mass market. So that's a good thing. And the co-marketing is phenomenal. They, Intel, AMD, we're around the world at trade shows that normally we wouldn't be able to scale toward that because they're supporting us and using our content to show off their hardware. So it gets you a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. sometimes we're even in unexpected places. So not like just GDC, but we'll bring content to like Sundance, you know, and different places that you might not even think of just because we're trying to get to the general consumer.
Yeah, HTC had this surfing competition in Venice,
right. Yeah.
and they asked us to be there, and we're like, of course. That's the other thing. Say yes to everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Say yes to everything and be a team player. And show stuff early on. As soon as it's good enough to show, engage with them early on, because their marketing plans are, you know, months and months in advance. So you want to get into having your content tell the story they want to tell about their hardware.
Right, exactly. Good point. And so we talking about relationships and partnerships. One of the you know, the important features now within games is getting the influencers, right? And I know we talked about this when we had our call last week. What about the influencers? I know, how do we get, you know, VR's a little bit different in terms of getting it to these, you know, the YouTube influencers, the streamers. What can we do to kind of help that process along?
Yeah, we're really big on influencer marketing, and I think what you're alluding to is that they often don't have the hardware to play your stuff. So we find that the influencer community is super interested in VR, but unless you get them into your studio or literally send them hardware, which we have done, they can't talk about it. So it's a good thing that we're located in Los Angeles, because a lot of the base is there, and we get people to come to our studio all the time. We have influencers. You know, we let them take over our social media channels as well. We do a lot of like co-curation of that. And you know, we're expanding into the arcade business at a very fast clip, and we're using influencers to help launch arcades. So for example, we had a partner, and I think it was in Phoenix, and we invited one of the key influencers from Smosh Games to go out there. And we had no financial stake in that arcade, but we wanted to show, as a partner giving content to that arcade, that we would drive people to their arcade. And this influencer, you know, was mobbed from the minute he got into the mall all the way there, and it was really, really successful. So I think this is a really, really important part of any marketing strategy.
I think too, like when you're looking at partnerships, I mean, one of the things you could do is say, hey, AMD, you know, these influencers are really important to us. Can you help us with some hardware, you know, and that could work out. And for people who are local to here, I mean, there's plenty of options, like Howie's Game Shack has like 10 VR setups and things like that. So that's a great idea. I think, you know, helping influencers be able to, and I have a lot of friends who are influencers, and I work with our influencer program managers and stuff like that. So I think, you know, some of the challenges is equipping them with the ability to continue to broadcast the message. So sometimes, you know, I mean, yes, they need the hardware. You know, I think we need to work with, you know, the headset manufacturers and find ways to capture videos better and do things like that. Another kind of, like, I think we need to be creative as a community too. Like, you know, one of my thoughts is, you know, party is probably not something your legal team wants you to use, but maybe you support VR gatherings at their house and give them, you know, swag or some sort of party kits or gathering kits for 10 or 20 or whatever of their friends to come over and play your game one evening or something like that. So, anyhow, I think I think influencers kind of untapped right now.
Right. So, Christine, specifically, I know, you know, Immersv focuses on ads within VR. So I'd love to kind of get your perspective on sort of some of the trends that you're seeing, what's working, kind of, can you give us a little bit of insight on that?
Super open-ended. All right, so marketing and ads in VR. So that could be a lot of different things, right? It could be anything from buying ads on Facebook and targeting people who own VR headsets, or specifically somebody who owns a Sony PlayStation VR or Daydream, right? So that's a pretty simple binary way to do it. There's also an emergence of VR ad platforms like ours and many others, where it's like most ad networks that everybody is somewhat familiar with, in that it's a network of publishers that are integrating an SDK and showing ads and getting paid, and then working with advertisers and agencies that are buying and being that middleman. The interesting evolution there is that because mobile ads have already evolved into this whole programmatic world where everything is plugged into DSPs and SSPs, VR ads are also taking that path, and very quickly, which is pretty exciting. So, for example, the way that, and I keep saying our network and others because I don't want to just talk about us, but all the different platforms have built out their own kind of SSPs, and that DSPs are buying programmatically. So for a VR publisher, so if there's any VR publishers or content creators in here, when you're showing ads, you won't only show like 5 or 6 ads, you'll be showing thousands of advertisers from the different programmatic platforms. So it's interesting to see the evolution there. And something that I know on the call that we talked about is, I'm sure people are interested in the metrics behind, how do VR ads work versus mobile ads or desktop ads. It is very similar in that it is video, or it could be a banner, but it is fully immersive. So it's the first time where you could surround your user 360 in headset in a full ad, really communicate that brand from end to end. So it's a very unique experience there. Just some stats, just because I like data. Recent case study that we did with Mountain Dew. If you've ever played the game Professor Presents, it's basically a basketball game. I'm personally not the target demo, but it's where you learn to dribble and work around the room with the basketball. But it's a pretty fun game, actually. They wanted to get to users that would be interested in learning that. So we ran their 30-second 360 video ad across the network, and we saw really, really amazing stats and numbers from that. So some examples of average video view-through rates was about 70%. So anybody here, and I see a lot of people here that work in mobile, usually it's about 30 to 40% for video completion. And the click-through rate, which in headset is actually a gaze-through rate, because you can't click on your face, you have to gaze at that. The average there was about 22%. Anybody in mobile knows it's usually about 1% or less. And on desktop, it's even lower than that. It's usually about 0.3%. So people are very engaged now in VR and 360 ads. So I think that's the general trend today. It's still looking good.
Oh, that's great.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's good news. That's amazing. And so how does this all sort of relate to kind of IP for VR? I mean, are we seeing that, like, does it matter if it's original, or can it be sort of a branded IP? Does that make a difference?
It's fun. It's changing. When we were founded in 2013, I joined. I was advising the founders. I joined in May of 2014, and it was early days. The hardware hadn't launched really yet, and it felt like the early days of Glue Mobile. Sorry to bring that up again, but it's when there's a low install base and a new consumer technology takes off. There's a perfect moment for an unencumbered brand like Survios to make a mark. And so we were really, really important for us to hit the ground running and get out early, and that was great. And we didn't need a piece of IP to do that. Our raw data was an original IP, and it's great, and it's done really well for us. However, as the marketplaces, these digital marketplaces get more crowded, we're hearing from the platform holders that they think IP will increasingly drive sales. So they're looking for any differentiator for featuring and for getting behind something. And they think of IP, like we do as well, as an ability not only to promote your content, but to promote VR in general. Because people will get excited by seeing their favorite IPs in VR. So it's changing for sure. Mm-hmm.
Quickly too. I mean, Christine, do you see a difference between original and branded?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say it depends, right? I mean, we've all seen cases where IP is incorporated into a game and content, and it doesn't fit, and usually that doesn't work out so well. So in the case that it fits, it's a good experience. We've actually done some research internally, just looking at the data on the network of, how does a performance video ad for kind of an indie dev versus like a Kim Kardashian or something where it's a name that people would know, and we've definitely seen a lift. It's hard to provide an average because it's not necessarily apples to apples, but at least like the click-through rate is almost double. At least that's what we've seen just across the campaigns on the network.
I'm super interested in how brands handle the fact that they can't fully control how their brands get used in VR. I'll give you an example. Yeah. I was at Oculus Connect 4, their conference this year, and in this Marvel experience, and we're all, like 6 of us are playing characters, and Thor comes up and gropes me. So sexual harassment in VR, got it. And I was like, that stuff gets streamed live, right? So like, how does Marvel handle that? And will happen. I remember when I was head of games at Yahoo, we had sex bot problem in our chat rooms, and we lost Pizza Hut for a period of time because someone sent Pizza Hut their ad unit next to a sex bot talk. And they were like, well, we can't control this content. So it's very, very interesting how brands will handle VR because it's much, much more free form.
Right.
Yeah. And especially something like Marvel or DC or, you know, where like, they're like sticklers for everything too. Yeah. They probably fell out of their chairs and had heart attacks from Thor groping.
One thing we sort of touched on a little bit here was the different markets for different headsets. And I think that's really interesting, and I'd love to kind of dig into that a little bit more, because I think you mentioned it before, Robert, is you know, each market is slightly different, and it hits a different demographic and a different user base. So, I mean, what do we have to think about for when we're, you know, marketing to maybe multiple platforms? You want to jump in?
I'll jump in. So yeah, this is fascinating times for this. So just like I was saying with the PlayStation audience, it's quite different and all that. But early on, it was a PC play, right? And so we were targeting hardcore gamers and hobbyists who could get VR up and running and could afford it. And it was a very specific demographic that's tended to skew a little bit older and male. As the arcade market takes off, let's add that as a platform here. As the arcade market takes off, that's a wholly different demographic. It's sure those people come, but we're seeing a lot of kids and families and women. There's about 40 to 60% ratio of male to female in the North American arcades. Interestingly, in South Korea, it's the opposite: 60% female, 40% male. So, and what kind of experiences do they want? You know, can raw data, this hardcore shooter, work in an arcade? It happens to, but more and more we're thinking, what else do we need to do to appeal to these audiences? I often like to think psychographically about the VR audience, by the way, and one of our marketing people likes to talk about the 3 Michaels: Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, and Michelangelo. So Michael Jordan is the kind of VR player who wants to be kick-ass, right? Michael Jackson wants to be expressive and express themselves, and Michelangelo wants to create like a tilt brush experience. And I think sometimes that's more helpful than really trying to target people because it's early days yet.
Mm-hmm. I love that analogy. That's amazing.
Yeah, Hunter Kitagawa came up with that.
That's really good.
Just to kind of address the question at a different angle as well, is for developers and for consumers, it's also a question of which platform should I develop for, given the audience or who you're trying to reach, right? And as a consumer, like, which device should I buy, right? Like, where is most of the content that I like going to be? So I think it's actually a really interesting time today, because we finally could look back at the last 2 years and see what happened with the platforms. And all the 2017 numbers just came out this week, so I don't know if you've seen them online, but I'll share them. So a year ago, so at the end of 2016, it was still super early. So HTC, Sony, Oculus, all were under 1 million units, probably about like 200 to 300,000 at that point. And then all the mobile VR headsets were also super new, so there's probably about maybe max 5 million headsets out there. The numbers just came out for 2017, where Sony hit 2 million devices, which is awesome, and Oculus and HTC combined is a little bit less than that. And then mobile VR did really well. So Gear VR is almost at 10 million, Cardboard is over 10 million, and Daydream even hit 2 to 3 million. So now we're no longer in the millions, we're in the tens of millions, which is exciting to see. So it's just also good to know, when you're developing for the platforms, do I want to focus on mobile VR only or just the premium ones? And if I want to reach the most users today, it would be Sony, right? But if that's not your target audience and you're more of a Michelangelo, you'll probably want to be on the Vive, right? So it just depends. But yeah, I think it's an interesting time to take a step back and look at the numbers today.
It also could be an indicator of how you want to, so even if you're, mobile users, all Rift users and Vive users and Sony users have mobile devices, right? And so they're probably seeing things in both places. So do you do, again, kind of content videos where you're showing something off and they can easily see it from their mobile device and say, hey, play it on your Rift, or hey, play it on your Sony PlayStation, or anything like that. So maybe where you put your marketing dollars is
too,
an area where that helps out too,
Yeah, I was, really pleasant. I went to the Sony Experience conference that they had here in Anaheim in December, and I was amazed at how much of the content was VR.
Yeah, they really supported it. It was good to see.
Yeah, and they're saying like 100 titles are going to be VR, but I would say, on the show floor, 70% was VR, that they were showing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes, I just thought of another thing to talk about. I've never experienced this in my career, and I've been on lots of different platforms with different types of games and everything, but it's early days in VR, and the development community themselves are extremely cooperative. It doesn't feel like we're enemies out to get each other, because we all want VR to succeed. And we've taken advantage of that fact in some marketing initiatives. For example, we had this initiative called Free Key Friday, because Steam you can get free keys from Steam, so Free Key Friday, and we would invite a developer to play our game to get a high score, and then we play their game to get a high score, and then we challenge our communities to beat those high scores, and we prize them. And we did that with a number of games, Rec Room, Arizona Sunshine, and it's just a really, really successful way to keep your audience engaged, because I think community engagement's a real issue and a good thing to think about. One of the first hires we did was a community manager, and keeping them engaged with events like that not only keeps your community happy, and it also reaches new people.
That's a good point. Yeah. Do you guys have any thoughts on community management?
In community management, so I think those ideas are brilliant, right? But like from my perspective, the community management is really an influencer management, right, for us and for our company. So it's so working with them to keep those influencers happy and talking and playing the games that we hope that they're interested in and that kind of thing. So keeping them happy with swag. But for me, it's more of the influencer program.
Yeah, which makes sense. Yeah. Christine, do you see that communities have an impact at all from an advertising perspective?
It's a totally different angle. I would say that the experts on community are the developers themselves. We're a little bit on the other side. But if there's anything to be said about sharing, it is a different culture than I feel like how mobile is sometimes, in that everybody wants to help each other. Everybody's making introductions to, here's your guy at HTC, and here's your woman at Oculus, and there's a lot more, I would say, kind of that sharing mentality. And then same thing in terms of monetization and advertising tips and tricks, right? There's always a lot of sharing. There's a lot of case studies that are out there on developers saying, hey, we made this much money and this is how we did it. Like the fact that you actually said that 3/4 of your installs came from featuring is huge. Like not everyone would share that. So thank you for sharing that.
Oops.
But that got me excited. So I just think it's a different culture, and yeah, cooperation is super important for a new space.
Yeah.
I kind of like it. It's like world peace starting with VR. We all get along. We all help each other out.
Right. We need that. I think, the thing that I found really inspirational was that, indie developers tend to be the ones that sort of are the first. You know, they try out the technology first, they work on the platforms first, and they put everything into what they're developing, right? And they do it through sweat, they do it through, you know, saved revenue from another game, and it's all kind of trying to figure out the platform. And I think we're at a point where, you know, we need to, as a community, be figuring out how can we make sure we can sustain these guys and women long enough so that we get to a place where the hardware and the market are ready for the content.
Yeah, and the platform holders are doing a good job.
Yeah.
Probably need to do more, I don't know, but like Oculus, for example, really targets developers who are indies that don't have deep pockets and gives them money. Or they'll take a company that does a different platform with their gaming and give them money to move into VR. So you're seeing a lot of that. And I'm glad you mentioned the indie community. I'm in love with this organization called IndieCade, which is kind of like the Sundance of video games. And early on, you started seeing VR there. You know, everyone adopted. And Oculus actually did a lot of their marketing through IndieCade in the beginning. So indies are important, but they won't survive this little, you know, trough of disillusionment without help. For sure.
Yeah. So, we still have some time, and I mean, are there any questions? We've kind of gone through a lot of the questions that we had, sort of in different bits and pieces. So, like, I'd love to just kind of get a little bit of inspiration from each of you. And Leslie, what would you say to a developer that's kind of really just starting out, that wants to kind of get themselves sort of into the VR market and figure out how to like get their game going?
I think like spreading the word about your game, I think as we touched on earlier, I think partnerships, whether it be hardware partnerships like with us, or even if you're reaching out to, you know, companies that are working on accessories, you know, maybe it's VR, you know, accessories that like Logitech or Sixth Sense or something like that, where you're reaching out to different people, and you don't have to restrict yourselves, you know, like the focus on your game, right? There's focus you have to do there. In terms of marketing and who you partner with, you don't have to have as much focus, because right now it's getting the experience out there to people. So if you're working with various partners, an accessory partner, a hardware partner, an HMD partner, multiple HMD partners, whatever, you know, find those areas where you can, you know, all these people are going to different places, and all these people are going to show off your content. I think when you do create the content and you give them something to show, like I said before, you know, kind of focus. You know, you see games where it's like they bring you through this massive, they give you something and it's like you have to go through this massive tutorial and do all these different things with the controllers. Well, maybe you just show one thing in one area. Maybe you're, I don't know, like RoboCop, just beating up the other robots with your fists versus going through the whole tutorial of what to do. So that, you know, so have a focused demo if you can do that, or a focused experience, but broaden yourself out and reach out to whomever you can to get your content out there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the timing right now is also interesting in that we've kind of gone through the wave of the premium headsets and mobile VR, and you know, if anyone was at CES last week, there were a lot of announcements about new headsets. So Vive Pro, so all these all-in-one headsets. So with Vive and Oculus and Sony, they're all doing it, and then there's a bunch of others that are popping up. These platforms are starving for good content, right? So it's a good time to start developing now and throwing ideas out and reaching out to the developer teams. They're also scaling out their teams, and they're all over here. I've seen them all over the conference. So I think it's a good time now to ideate before these platforms launch, so you could ideally be there at launch. I mean, if I think about all the developers we've worked with, I mean, it's definitely an 80-20 rule of only 20% of them have made it, but they all made it through partnering with the right partners in the beginning, launching, you know, getting that premium title out there in the beginning, bringing it back to freemium, figuring out how to monetize it. But they all started launching with the partners first. So that's where we saw at least the most success.
I couldn't agree with you both more. It's so important, and that's the world we're living in. Our third game is called Electronauts, and it's a game where you get to DJ in VR and produce music. It's completely crazy great. And iMac Pro is having a launch event in December for their new device, which supports VR. And we were able to be on stage with them, and they talk about our game, and that's how we announced our game to the world. So stuff like that can really make a difference. We generated a lot of good press, including Variety, with that. But it's so funny too. When Microsoft announced its Windows Mixed Reality, here's a funny story. It's kind of tragic actually. We were going to be on the stage with Raw Data, which is a shooting game, right? At the announcement, and. Vegas tragically happened the weekend before, and there was a big debate on that. So it's like the kind of content you have and where it's appropriate and where not is something to think about, But these launch, if you see hardware being announced and it's going to launch, try to become a launch partner. The last thing I'd say is frequent visits to your partners. They're moving a mile a minute. They're understaffed. I can't tell you how many opportunities arose because we put our faces in front of them. And then the following week they go, hey, this opportunity just came up, Survios, you want to do it? And that really makes a difference. So frequently check in with your partners.
And I'll double agree with that. Keep checking in, yeah. That's very important because people get distracted. It's not even overstaffed, it's distraction. Now, everybody has ADD these days.
Yeah, that's true.
So you mentioned partnerships for small indie dev teams. How would you recommend establishing that? Like, what's step one for establishing a partnership with something that's producing hardware?
Go to places like this and shake everyone's hand and get their card. That's super important. Literally, you could call up the developer of your favorite VR game and say, hey, can you give me a content? And I bet 9 times out of 10 they will. So just be aggressive and not be shy. They want to meet you.
Hi there. Thank you guys so much for being here this afternoon. My name is Preston Weiler. I'm the marketing lead for, I think, the only VR title in the Indie Showcase today. So come by afterwards, please. We're enthusiastic. My question for you guys is really...
That was a form of marketing.
Yeah.
Nicely done.
Clearly, there's some sort of formal education I've had in this. No, but the question for me is, how are you accessing PR? I think that clearly partnerships are a huge aspect of the ecosystem. But we've had issue actually getting into the right hands as far as PR. So what would be some insights that you could give to make that entire side of marketing more accessible for us?
I didn't hear it. Can you say?
Am I too far away? Am I good now? I'm very sorry. So for us, we see that partnerships are clearly hugely important for the platform. We're interested in tips or tricks of how PR could be more accessible for us as an indie developer. And what kind of stuff you could share with that for make that more accessible for us in general and people like us.
PR.
Yeah, using PR, actually being able to utilize that aspect because we don't necessarily have a huge paid budget, and it seems like from what we've seen, paid budgets don't go anywhere in virtual reality.
Yeah, we have some success driving people from Facebook through targeting to our Steam pages and stuff like that, but you're right, it's not there yet.
And you guys have legitimate recognition. I mean, you guys are clearly the biggest on the platform, so it's for us small little devs, it's very, very challenging, even especially with paid.
Call us up and do a Freaky Friday with us, for example. Do you know what I mean? Also, think about the PR cycle. So we think of GDC as a tech announcement kind of conference, where E3 is non-tech, it's more entertainment. So at GDC, we always have a piece of technology that we're talking about, and that seems to generate good press. So there's lots of ways to answer your question, but establishing relationships with the key press people is very, very, very important. And a lot of times, I get called by press all the time who just don't want to cover us, but they want information about the space, and you nurture those relationships over time. So again, it's all about introduction. If anyone has a press pass here, you get their card.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all.
Just to echo on that, so for a lot of the indies that we work with, I would say trying to do PR on your own is hard without all the connections and relationships. There's a lot of interesting kind of one-person PR consultants that are all over. And we work with one, and they're amazing, and we just pay them on an hourly or monthly basis. And they have a press list, right? And every time we have something to launch, they go out and put that out there, and then they're off the clock. So, I mean, you could just pay for it, right? As long as it's good content and you're putting that out there, it's definitely something that you could basically just buy with the right consultant.
Hi. Speaking of like tips and tricks, I was wondering if you had any insight, secret handshakes to get that featured spot on Steam. How does that work?
Well, back in the feature phone days, it was, like I said, golf and dinners and things like that. That doesn't seem to work now. They want the best content possible. So the first and foremost thing is produce the best content you possibly can. And again, just be in their face a lot. That really, really helps.
Okay, so Nicole Lazzaro from Zio Design. I had a question about what was the, if you could share a story of like what the most surprisingly successful, marketing or, PR sort of strategy people have had for VR. Or you could also tell something that you thought worked, but didn't.
Such a good question. Okay. I'm going to say the negative of this. I think we underestimated the awareness of VR that's not PlayStation VR in the PlayStation community. I think we could have targeted that community more. And I can't think of everything's been pretty good. We experimented, I'm saying all negative things, what the hell. We experimented with content marketing. We developed a raw data comic and went to Comic-Con with it and all that. And it was nice to drive more awareness about the world and to build up the IP a bit more outside the game. But it didn't move the needle in terms of sales. So I think right now it's really down and dirty, and it's getting featured as the thing. And I think things change over time when things become more mass market. We're just not there yet.
Well, this isn't games focused, but just in terms of interesting PR things that have worked and that have moved me. I don't know if anyone likes Tom's shoes, but if you go to the Tom store in Venice, you could go in and they actually have a full VR setup where you could go in, sit down, they put the headset on you, and they take you to Peru where they actually give back shoes to the kids, and it's this very emotional experience. So I think that is like on-site PR that is literally shoved into people's faces and they love it. So I think examples like that, I know not in gaming, but within VR are super interesting.
But that's really interesting because VR doesn't have anything to do with Tom's shoes, but they've incorporated the technology into something that is sort of corporate relations, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know the story, but the founder basically created this company because he wanted to give back a percentage of the money to go to kids who don't have shoes. So it actually paints that whole story. And I didn't know any of that until I put on the headset and actually experienced it.
I thought of something else, Nicole.
So for what VR does, I do a lot of work on emotion and gameplay, like how gameplay creates emotions. And what VR does really well is compassion, empathy, walking in someone else's shoes.
Totally. Yeah.
And so it is not only surprising in the sense of getting across a corporate message, but because they chose that medium, it's particularly suited for generating the emotions that are very on brand for that particular brand. So it's a great strategy, great use of VR because of it's moving people emotionally in the way that they want them to feel about what is a shoe.
And there's my perspective is obviously very different because we're from the hardware. So what's a success for us, right, is very different than what's success for you guys, right? But so then it's all based on, it really is events and how we evangelize and tell people. And there's, big success stories like, Howie's Game Shack, and our hardware being in there and supporting not just the, the general gaming side, but also the VR and such. But I like to, I really enjoy the small successes. So I guess is kind of where I'm going. Like there was a New Year's Eve party that I went to that was, kind of tied very loosely to a game developer. And so I brought out some PCs where people didn't expect it. It wasn't, general gamers there. It was just people going into a restaurant, and there was hundreds of them lining up to play on these PCs and get and experience that probably 99% of them had not experienced yet. And so to me, just kind of seeing those reactions and having people look and say, what do I need to do to get into this? You know, I see that more in those just little successes.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned emotion, Nicole. Like our second game, Sprint Vector, which is a racing game, 8-player racing game, was on the floor of E3 this year, and we set up a tournament and we gave prizes out, and it, you know, that emotion of wanting to be victorious and competitive and all of that, we really played it out and allowed people to be expressive around it, and it really worked well for us. And we're about to launch a multi-arcade tournament as well to generate buzz in the arcades. One small little thing that I think is interesting, if you're an indie and you want a publisher like ours to publish you into arcades, we're very interested in that. And we're finding good success in helping these, particularly the mom and pop arcades, by delivering swag posters to them so that they can actually, you know, decorate their place with the stuff that they're playing. So just a thought on that.
Okay. Good. Thank you guys so much for
Thank you.
joining us. It was
Thank
really
you.
interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.